I'm glad that what we were able to capture is connecting with people.
And you had to cast that little tiny fish for Sinqua's character to put back, which must
So
have been a
funny
challenge.
story. Tell you a funny story.
Hey everyone, this is David Stark from Watcher Pass. Today I'm talking to Joshua Caldwell, the director of Mending the Line, which came to theaters on June 9th, 2023. I'm going to talk to him right now. And while you're watching, if you can like and subscribe to this channel, that would be fantastic. I'll spend a lot. Thank you. All right, so thanks so much for joining me. Today I've got Joshua Caldwell, the director of Mending the Line, which came to theaters on June 9th, 2023. It is an emotional, heartfelt story about grief and I guess maybe the strange things that people do to kind of overcome it and find some peace in life. It is a beautiful film. It's a heartfelt film. I'm very excited to talk to you. So thanks so much for joining me.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So the first question, this is always an easy one for directors. How'd you get involved in this project? How did this come to your desk?
Yeah, so the script came to me, which is funny because anybody I told to about the film after I got involved, they were all like, "Oh, did you write it? Did you come up with the idea?" And I was like, "No, I had absolutely nothing to do with it." But our producer, Kelly McKendry, had started calling any producer she could find that had made a movie in Montana. And just to get the lay of the land, figure out what it's like. And she called my manager, who had produced a movie that took place in Montana, but was not shot in Montana. And he told her that, but he said, "What's the story? What's the script?" And she told him. And he's a fly fisherman, and I'm a fly fisherman. And he basically was like, "Do you have a director yet?" She said, "No." And he said, "Well, I've got a director for you. Can I send it to him?" And she said, "Yes." I read the script and I fell in love with it. I'm a passionate fly fisherman myself, and I'd been doing a lot of research around PTSD and veterans and soldiers returning from war. But it was related to projects that just didn't go anywhere. And so this became this like merging of two passions and two interests, and in just kind of a perfect story. And so I knew I had to do it, and I pitched them, but I effectively begged them to let me direct it.
That's awesome. I love that like your personal interest was perfectly situated to this film. I don't think any of my personal interests would ever like help me professionally, but I love that yours did in this moment.
It's not common at all, you know. I mean, I guess if you have a personal interest in like blowing things up and car crashes, like that can work in the movie industry. But yeah, I mean, there's only a handful of movies that have ever featured fly fishing in any way. And so it's just not really a common thing. So that's why I just was like, man, I feel like I hope I get this one.
So you were like the trout in the river, and the script was, I don't know which lure it would be, and you were
Yeah, it
just
was a
like waiting
fly
and
floating on the
popped up.
surface.
It hooked you, hook, line,
Yep.
sinker, all those words.
Yep. Every pun intended.
Excellent. Okay. So the next question, this is easy because I was wondering, like, did you have to do any reading to get up to speed on this subject? But it sounds like you already knew about fly fishing. You already were interested in veterans, so this was kind of the perfect match for you. Strangely, like randomly, but also kind of serendipitously.
Yeah, I mean, the fly fishing I had an understanding of. I had a philosophical understanding of why it worked, and I had, a technical understanding of how to do it. That doesn't mean we didn't have, technical advisors and other people that really know a lot more than I do, but that was sort of a demand from the beginning that we make sure we get this right. The challenging thing though is I'm not a veteran. I have no personal experience with PTS. That's not something that I'm familiar with at all. And as much as I've done research, this film is not really a film you can just go make and do justice. It's not like a family drama. It's not a thriller, where you can just make stuff up. I really felt, the challenge to me and put to me by a number of the vets we talked to was to try and really get this movie right and make it a movie that veterans could actually watch, because they don't tend to watch movies about the military. They don't think they're that great. They don't think that they tell the real story. And so in our case, I really felt like I wanted to do honor and service to, or honor and justice to, those that have given their lives or given a part of themselves or lost somebody, but those that made that sacrifice. And so that's really what it came out of. And that involved us just doing a tremendous amount of research, talking to as many veterans as we could, talking to veterans that had gone into fly fishing, become guides, like found sort of saving in it. And so, that perspective actually ended up really informing a lot of the film.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that shines through. Like I love that you kind of recognize that was something you had to get right, because I see a lot of films that have PTSD represented. And sometimes it's done well, sometimes it feels, kind of like, I don't know, a Hollywoodized version of it. This one, it felt about right. It felt like, there was, I love how the character kind of physically he seemed fine, but then the real kind of damage was internal, and it's hard to quantify that and show that on film. I think this film did a good job of showing how that can kind of affect you and how that just pops in and it affects your daily life.
Yeah, I mean, thank you. I think that like that's been echoed by others, and I think that's probably the proudest aspect of the film for me is that we got the representation of PTS or PTSD, however you want to refer to it, as accurately as we could within the confines of making a movie, right? Like you said, it is a very mental thing. How do you represent that on screen? How does PTS manifest itself in your daily life? And in order to understand that, right, we just had to talk to a lot of people. We had to have that conversation among a lot of people. And there's only so much you can really do. Like, nobody's really brought this up, but the scene where Colter's walking and he encounters the trash, right? That came out of a conversation I had with a Marine who said like he would be driving. He's like, I can drive down the same street every single day and pass a pile of trash. And just out of nowhere, one day, I'll suddenly have this physical, mental, like it'll have an effect on me, right? And for people that don't know what that trash can represents, IEDs are often hidden in piles of trash in Afghanistan and Iraq. And these veterans have sort of, experienced when they were in combat, they've experienced the stress and the anxiety over seeing a pile of trash. And that was sort of a psychological torment in a lot of ways, against the US soldiers by, hiding in the trash and then making every trash pile appear to be dangerous, right? So people don't think about that. Like when you're constantly experiencing a threat from like a pile of garbage and you come home and people put their garbage out, not really thinking anything about it, that has an instant, effect on somebody. And then they're left to go like, why am I stressed? There's no threat here. Right. But their body is instantly, the fight or flight is instantly elevated by the sight of it. And so things like that, as a way of sort of representing it, Colter often, Sinqua and I talked a lot about how does PTS manifest itself physically. It's a tightness in the collar, right? It's an inability to breathe. It's a desire to be out of enclosed spaces. It's the way of holding yourself, a tension that sort of, comes through the body when that's, and so, we had a lot of discussions about that with veterans in order to help and doctors and people from the VA in order to really try and find a performance-based way of conveying to the audience what the experience of PTS is like.
Yeah, and that's crazy. Just like the innocuous things that would affect someone's life, and that is just tough for someone who hasn't been there and hasn't had to like be on edge and seen what the consequences of that, what that will do to you years later after the fact. And like you said, sometimes it would affect a Marine and sometimes it wouldn't, and you just don't know when that's going to trigger.
I mean, the simplest way for most of us now to understand that, and I'm wading into a bit of a political thing here, but I'm doing it just as an example, which is, with COVID, right? Like COVID was a situation where we were all told to mask up, and those who were not masked were sort of posed as a threat, right? Like we were told, you got to mask up, you got to protect yourself. And if you're not, that's like something you got to stay away from, you got to keep your distance, right? And so suddenly we're now trained that when we see somebody without a mask, at least during that time, all of a sudden it was like, wait a second, your sort of alarm bells are going off, right? Because you've been told this one thing and you've come to expect it, and it's not the norm anymore, right? Everybody's masked. And so that's a way in which the body, and people may not even actually be perceptive of that. They may not have realized the way their sort of fight or flight kicked in at that moment. But if you had a genuine fear of catching COVID or even just understanding that I don't want this, right? And you're taking precautions, you seeing somebody without a mask is not that different from a veteran seeing a pile of garbage. If they've been in a situation where their mind has linked seeing that pile of trash with an IED, right? And the whole thing is you don't really know if there is one or not. especially in Iraq. There could be, there could not be, right? They didn't put them in every one of them. They just put them in some. And so I think that's a way for people to sort of understand the way in which all of a sudden there's a tension and there's like a complete transformation in what you're experiencing in a way that, you know, in the smallest way could be equitable to the way veterans are walking around and suddenly they see this thing and it just, they're not even trying. It just comes out of nowhere. That's what they were always telling to me. They were like, it just came out of nowhere. And then it's really hard to stop it.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that's a great analogy, because even like now, after, you know, we're quote unquote over COVID, whatever you want to say, like if someone coughs in a store, like I react,
forget
right?
it.
Like, you know, it should be fine, and it's probably fine, but you still kind of have that visceral reaction because of all that time that we spent.
It's a fight or flight response. I remember I was listening to an interview on Being, and she was talking with the neurologist, and the neurologist was saying, she was talking about how like she doesn't really think that people really fully understand the effect of the last 3 years have had on us. And I sort of was reflecting back on my own experience and knowing like, man, like every time I walked into a grocery store during that time, my whole fight or flight was elevated, you know? And I sort of look back on that like, man, like constantly every week being in that situation, you know, I think I personally, I thought I weathered it pretty well, but when I really thought back on it, I was like, man, like that was a constant thing that was hitting me. And I remember feeling it. I remember thinking like, okay, like I'm, you know, I've got to be ready. Right. I'm aware now of everything. And so, yeah, I mean, imagine living with that every single hour of every single day in a combat zone, and then kind of being brought back to the United States and being put into, and you go, oh, well, you know, we go, oh, it's relaxing here. There's nature and people are just hanging out, you know, but all of a sudden, you know, a car backfiring, people shooting guns off. If you're in that type of state, you know, I mean, people shoot guns in their backyard. You know, I mean, Colter in the film, like he hears a chair bang, but the sound of that chair banging, hitting the floor, crashing to the floor, echoes the sound of a gunshot. And there's just an immediate, like without even thinking about it, there's a trained reaction to that situation that is totally benign, but your mind is not experiencing it as benign, right? And so I think that's that they come back and they're sort of constantly, not only are they confronted by the memories, the haunting memories and haunting experiences that they've had, but they come back to a society and to a country that is not really helping them with a soft landing. You know, they're not really giving them a runway to sort of re-entering that society. They kind of go like, great, here you go, right? And they're left with all this experience that they don't know how to process. They can't figure out how to process. And I think that's a real challenge that they come back with.
Yeah, for sure. And I know the military itself is getting better about kind of addressing this and having it be more open, but it is still a culture where you know, don't want to express any sort of mental concerns, any sort of mental holdups, because, you know, that's could affect you in the field. That could affect, you know, what happens. And so it is a very, I think this movie also does a really good job of showing just kind of like the difficulty there, where you know, Josh wants to get back, or you know, the character wants to get back into the fight. He wants to get back there, but there are unforeseen scars that could affect that and are holding him up. And it's kind of this very tough push and pull for him.
Well, and time again, right? Like, because I was just down in DC at a screening and talking to a lot of vets, and like over and over again, vets are like, man, I mean, I'm really happy with the things that they feel we got right. And I think we've been constantly heard from a lot of vets about what we did get right in this film. But one of the things they always point to is like the lying on the PTSD questionnaire, you know, saying, no, they're like, I did that, right? It goes back to what you were just saying, this sort of culture of like, don't admit to things, don't like subscribe to things, you know, because one, if you do, you're definitely not going back. Like in Colter's case, like if he were to say yes on any of those questions, that would be it, right? And he knows that. So he's deliberately lying, preventing himself from getting probably the care that he might need. Because, you know, you might be able to heal physically, but if you're not there mentally, you're definitely not going back. And so that was something I've heard time and time again about sort of the aspects that we really hit on that many veterans experience themselves.
And speaking of that specific test, one of the aspects that I saw in that what like spoke to me, there was a CRT monitor in that VA institution, which I was like, Of course, the VA would probably have a CRT monitor. Where did you even find one? Or was that
Right. Yeah,
time
exactly. I
appropriate?
know.
Or
Well, it's that kind of thing, which was like, again, overall, we weren't interested in making the VA the villain here,
yeah.
right? They're not the bad guy in this movie, and we really wanted to walk that fine line. We needed to get Colter out fishing, right? We couldn't have group therapy work, and we couldn't really have the traditional therapies that the VA might push at the moment, like working. But we also didn't want to demonize them because the VA is trying and they are doing a lot of different work, and so it was walking that fine line. So, like for example, Sal Martinez, who is the double amputee in that group scene, he talks about how therapy works for him, right? How it's a big part of his healing. So it is working for some guys, right? In our case with Colter, it's not. So we needed to get him outside. We needed to show that it was not working for him, and that was a fine line to walk. But I think that with the setting, right? I mean, look, we were an independent film. We didn't have like we could build our own VA facility. We kind of had to go with what we had available, right? And so, but at the same time, you go, okay, there's probably a representation of government is probably a little bit more accurate in that they have CRT monitors or like paint cracking off the wall, unfortunately. But that was mostly our production designer who I left that to, and he did quite a bit of research.
So
that's on what might still be in the VA. Yeah.
No, that was perfect. That was a nice little touch. You're talking about some of the therapy scenes. I was curious, were some of those people that were speaking and involved, were they military members? Because it seemed like some of those stories were personal and some of those kind of like testimonials came from the heart. I wasn't sure. I couldn't tell if that was really
so
good
like
acting or if they were military folks.
Saul, again, the WMPT, he's a vet. Obviously, he had done a lot of work with Warriors in Quiet Waters. He actually, funny enough, we partnered with Warriors in Quiet Waters. And so we were working with them on a bunch of stuff. But Saul came through like our local casting director. And I was like, you could have just called, like, we thought he was just an actor and a vet, obviously. But yeah, I mean, I was like, I'm not faking this. And I think his story is so compelling. Even when he showed up, he's like, what do you want me to say? And I'm like, I want you to just tell your story. I'm not going to write that for you. Like whatever you're willing to share, obviously. I'm not asking you to, if you don't want to do that, we'll come up with something. But he was like, no. And I just said, just be honest and sort of tell your story. Your point of view is that this therapy is helpful to you, right? And so maybe feed that in. And then a lot of I don't know if all of them were, but I would say a majority of the men and women in a lot of those scenes at the VA are actual veterans.
Yeah, I think it showed. Like you could definitely tell that the mannerisms, the kind of like stories that were being told, they felt real to me, which is always kind of a nice thing to have in an indie film where you've got things that kind of just feel natural and real. So
yeah, I mean, I think that why fake it when you can have the real thing, and at the same time, hey, get these guys and let them share their story, right? So I think that was definitely important to us, to involve the veteran community, to involve the fly fishing community, to get a lot of those groups sort of involved and on board, which lent this film, like you said, kind of a level of authenticity that you don't often get in indie films.
For sure. And let's speak to some of the most important co-stars, the fish themselves. What was it like filming fishing? Was it tough? Was it easy? Like, was it fun? I mean, it probably was fun to film fish. Maybe it was frustrating. What was that like?
Yeah, no, I mean, anytime you involve water, it's challenging. And then anytime you involve animals, it's challenging. Thank God we didn't have kids fishing, because that would have been the trifecta, and I don't know what would have happened. But I mean, it's just a process, and I think that with the fishing, you're challenged by things like weather, you're challenged by continuity. And certainly, the fact that like you're not actually fishing, right? So you can't really go out and spend like, a couple weeks just shooting a bunch of fly fishing stuff and then cut it all together into a montage. Like you have to really design it. And you have to really know how you're approaching everything, because you have, for example, you've got the casting, which is one element. You've got the fish taking the fly, which is another element. You've got the fight, which is another element. Or the hook set, right? You got the hook set, the line goes tight. That's another element. Then you got the fighting the fish, and then you got the actual fish. And so, it was compounded by the idea that, or by the fact that we hadn't, people didn't really do it, right? There'd been only really one other movie that featured fish, which was A River Runs Through It. And so my question for the beginning was just how do we do the fish? Because, if you want to do a car accident, you could call 50 people, right, in Hollywood, and they know how to do it. But the fishing is not a common thing. And so we ended up actually going back to a lot of the guys that had worked on A River Runs Through It, and spoke to a lot of those guys. A couple of them actually worked on the film, in order to figure out how do you guys do it, right? Because obviously River Runs Through It is held up as such a paradigm of a fly fishing film. We wanted to emulate that. And so a lot of it was just these little, tips, like off screen, for the hook set, somebody's just holding the line or it's tied to a log, and then you get that rod raised. And then, if you're fighting the fish, that's a half-gallon milk jug filled with rocks and then filled with water. So it sinks, but it's floating, right? And that's how you're fighting the fish down the river. Oh. And then the actual fish themselves were a big thing, right? Because in A River Runs Through It, all the fish you see are dead, right? Even at the very end, when Brad Pitt's holding up his huge fish, it's not a live animal anymore. And but in our movie, because at the time they kept the fish they caught, they didn't catch and release. But in our film, and especially among modern day fly fishermen, catch and release is the norm. It's the practice. And so we need real fish, like we need live fish in order to see them being released back into the water. So we hired a guy named Joe Urbani, who was the original fish wrangler on A River Runs Through It. And he came on board, and we met with him. He's a fisheries biologist. So this is what he does. And I said to him, he basically said, I can purchase a couple of these fish, because we had very specific species that we wanted to feature. They're all trout for the most part, but there's brown trout, there's rainbow trout, there's cutthroat trout. And he could purchase a couple different fish. He could purchase the whitefish, he could purchase, or Senor Blanco in the film, and he could purchase the cutthroats. But the browns and the rainbows, he'd have to catch. And so I just said, how are you gonna catch the fish, Joe? Because kind of need a guarantee here. And he said, well, in the mornings, I'm going to go out and fish, and then I'll bring them by a set. I said, well, I'm a fly fisherman, Joe, and I would never want that job. But also I would love to go fly fishing with you, because apparently you know exactly where you can actually catch fish and can guarantee it. And he laughed. But that's what he did, And so the challenge was due to a lot of Montana laws, conservation laws and environmental laws. Like, we had to catch the fish from the fisheries or from the bodies of water where we were planning to shoot them. Mm-hmm. So each morning Joe would go out and he'd fish, and he had a big oxygenated tank on the back of his truck, and he'd keep the fish very happy and very well oxygenated, and until screen time. And then we'd bring him out and put him in front of the camera, and then we'd let him go.
They say if you do what you love, you don't work a day in your life. And that sounds amazing.
Yeah. I wish we had more, look, we're an indie film. I wish we had more time to shoot that stuff. You hear on River Runs Through It, they shot fish stuff for 3 weeks, and you're like, man, 3 weeks is almost our whole schedule. Mm-hmm. And so that is the challenge, right? You're trying to get a lot in a very little amount of time, and you're doing something that is, again, fairly technical in its execution, because you've got, for example, in that montage alone, you've got 4 characters fishing. Mm-hmm. You've got, so you got to capture 4 times the normal material, whether that's the casting or the hook set or actual fish. And, that takes quite a bit of time to pull off. So, I'm glad that what we were able to capture is connecting with people.
And you had to cast that little tiny fish for Sinqua's character to put back, which must have been
funny story. Tell you a funny story. So we were fishing at Depews. We shot all that fishing montage and the opening scene. Yeah, that whole sequence, basically from the arrival to the lunch, was all shot at a spring creek called Depews, which is a very famous spring creek in Montana. And basically we showed up, and the day before was my day off, and I fished a lot on my day off. So I went fishing at Depews that day.
Day off. I love it.
Went fishing at Depews, scouting, right? So I could write it off. No, but I went fishing at Depews, and I caught some really beautiful fish, out of this waterfall, some really good sized browns. And I have pictures to prove it. So I'm not just talking about it, but and so when we got there the next day and we were shooting, we had shot the sort of scene where Lucy and Colter arrive, and then we shot the lunch, right? We did those 2 back to back, and then we were going to break for lunch, and then we were going to go shoot all the fishing montage stuff. And so we, as we're shooting these scenes, I know that Joe and our writer Steven and everybody are down at another part of Depews fishing, trying to catch fish. And I just hear on the radio, we're having trouble. We're not catching fish. So I go, it's all right. I got this, right? I was here yesterday. I know where to catch some fish. And so we break for lunch. I hop in my car. I zip over to the waterfall area and I get my rod out and I proceed to fish exactly where I had the day before. And I catch nothing. I mean, I'm like, when I fished the day before, I put a fly in there and on the first cast, I got a big brown. So I was like, I knew where to put the fly, but there was just nothing in there. And finally, I managed to eke out like a fish that was probably a foot long brown and then this little tiny brown. And I said, you know what? I earned these and they're going in the montage. And so I had the idea, like, it would be really funny, like, to have Colter, catch this really small fish, but it's still being meaningful to him. Right. And because really, like, I mean, people enjoy fishing for little brookies, which can be like this big. Right. And so then there's meaning in that. And so anyway, long story short, the act of that, a little bit of my arrogance, which, then I had to eat crow or eat brown trout when I caught this little trout, ended up becoming a great narrative within the montage, in a way that is different than just a bunch of the same size fish, or a bunch of big fish. Like, and I really appreciate the fact that like that little brown trout at the very end gets a laugh every time. So it worked, and I got to, experience a little bit of humility, as Ike says, the first lesson of fly fishing. So
yeah, no, for sure. I love that. And I love that it's, like you said, he's still happy to catch that fish like that. It's the act of doing it. It's the act of kind of being successful. It doesn't matter how big the fish is. He's just happy to be out there and to have something to catch and then release as well. So I think
for sure.
That's a good moment in the film. So I know we have limited time. I'm going to switch. I call it the lightning round. They're just very lightweight questions about the film. I want to see how your personal experiences map to things in the film. You can feel free to pass on any of them. I won't be offended, but I try to keep them very answerable.
Yeah, that sounds good. I hope my answers may not be lightning, but the questions can be for sure.
Okay. Well, no, we'll see. We'll see.
Yeah.
So the first question is, have you ever been to a VA hospital or like a VA building?
I have not. I did not get a chance to tour or visit any prior to making the film. So I did not have that opportunity, but we were able to get the script to the VA, some high ups at the VA, and they provided us and my production designer and our producers and the writer with some really invaluable feedback about the VA and its process and all that kind of stuff. So, we had to rely, for purposes of the film, we had to rely on photographs and that kind of feedback as opposed to actually visiting. So I've never had a chance, unfortunately.
Well, it was accurately represented. So at least you had the right people, behind you and the right information from the VA. What have you ever made your own lures?
So just a little fly fishing. So we don't call them lures. Actually.
Oh no.
We call them flies.
Okay.
Lures are all the spin fishing guys. We don't do that. No, yeah. So I do tie my own flies. In fact, the vise that Ike is using in the film is my own personal vise. But yeah, I do tie my own flies.
Very nice. And where is the place that you have felt most at peace?
Good question. So there isn't a specific place, but it's on a river. There's an experience I had. I guess it is a specific place. There's a specific place I go to on a river that's near me in Connecticut. And I remember a couple summers ago, in fact, it was a COVID summer when I was out fly fishing with my buddies. And where this section of river is right next to a campground. Mm-hmm. And I remember in the late evening, we were fishing and the fishing was really great, and the bugs were coming off and we were getting them on dry flies and you could smell the campfires coming down off the campground. And there was just this total feeling of like complete calm and complete peace and complete like, oh, I love just where I am right now. And that's a feeling I go back to, even though that spot, the fishing has not been great the last 2 years. I constantly go back there often in the evening in summer just to have that to relive that experience.
That sounds wonderful. And this might be a related question, but where do you want to retire? Because I feel like Montana might be a good choice.
I don't know. My wife and I have talked often about the beach. which is, I know, not rivers and all that stuff. I think my hope is to get a lot of that done while I'm still in my prime. And then when I'm much older, to me, I think it's just like being near water for sure, but sunshine and easy walks in the morning and things like that. So we've always talked about sort of the beach as a possible retirement destination.
Very different type of fishing, but you can still fish there.
You still do it.
A little farther
Oh,
out.
yeah.
Yeah.
You can still do it.
What is the last Hemingway book that you read?
Last Hemingway book I read was, what's it called? Islands in the Stream. You ever read that one?
I have not. No, I'm a poor reader. Only books I've read are the ones that were required for me to read in like 10th grade. So.
Okay. So Islands in the Stream is sort of an unfinished book of his. I don't know if it was ever fully edited. I think like later his estate like did an edit of it or something like that. But the first book is really great. It takes place down in like an island in the Bahamas, but back in like, whatever it was, the 50s or 60s. Mm-hmm. And just the description of island culture, but it's about a painter, right? Instead of a writer, but it's Hemingway, and his sons are coming down to visit him. But it's just like a really enchanting story about an area that I don't know. And I love often going back to it. I really love rereading things. So like I've read The Sun Also Rises multiple times, and, a lot of Hemingway's books I enjoy going back to. But the Islands in the Stream was the last one that I read.
Very nice. Very nice. And this is probably related, could be fishing, but it could be something else. Is there anything that you do that kind of like puts you at peace? Maybe it's multiple things.
I mean, I would say it's definitely fishing. That's been sort of my go-to over the last 6 years as I've gotten into it. I lived in LA for 10 years, and then 6 years ago moved back to upstate New York. And that's when I actually started fly fishing. I had never fly fished before then. So to me, that was really ultimately my connection to the film, right? As much as I know how to fly fish, I understood why fly fishing is so powerful as a therapeutic device, right? And because even though I've never experienced PTS and I don't have, any of those kinds of, things that veterans do, I'm a guy who lives in my head a lot, right? I'm often creating, right? It's not physical work, it's mental work, right? And sometimes it can get exhausting. And the power of fly fishing is that it forces you to be present. Like you cannot be thinking about anything else in order to do it correctly. You can't think about anything else because you are standing in a river. You're feeling the current push against you. You're trying to get your cast right. You got to cast it a specific way to get the fly out there. And that fly may only drift on the water for like 6 inches before you got to pick it up and do it again. And so it forces you into the present. Mm-hmm. And you just don't think about anything else. And so I know, just for me, for a guy that's often thinking about the next script or the story problem or what you're working on or all the politics of it or all the BS about making movies, it's really peaceful to like just go and be on a river, be out in nature, and your only focus is trying to get a fish to eat your fly, right? And so I can only imagine what it might be for people who are really suffering from PTS and really suffering from trauma and the power of that, because I felt it in my own small way. But yeah, no, absolutely. Being on a river and fishing for me is the ultimate sort of peaceful destination.
For sure. And I like how you kind of like brought it back to like having to focus and having to be in the moment. I worked with someone one time who also very mental type of job, and he would race cars, like fast race cars. I asked him why, and he's like, because when I'm on the track, like I'm not thinking about the other things we have to do. I'm not thinking about that. I'm focused on driving, and just like that is the only thing that I can think about at that moment. And so
it's exactly that. It's mountain biking, it's surfing, it's anything that sort of forces you into an activity that I used to ride motorcycles when I was in LA, and it's the same thing. It's just like you just cannot be thinking about something else, right? You have to focus on the present, not only just for safety, but like just the act of doing it forces you into that perspective. And I think that's what we heard from a lot of veterans too. Maybe they didn't fly fish, but they surfed, they worked with horses, they hiked, they mountain biked, right? It's sort of these kinds of activities, like you said, racing cars. Like you're not thinking about your job, you're not thinking about that tax form you forgot to fill out. Like, if you do, you're crashing, right? Like you've got to exist in the present. And I think that's what we do so little of as a society, and that's something that's really hard for us. But when you do these activities that force you into it, you just you can't think about anything else. And so I think that's really where that power lies in a lot of those activities.
For sure. And fishing in the LA River, very different from fishing in upstate New York, I imagine.
Yeah, but you know what? You could go carp fishing, which is like the new hot thing in
really?
fly fishing. Oh yeah, because okay, so like you're pursuing a trout, right? Trout are jerks. Like they refuse your fly. They're hard to catch. Like, you know, they're just annoying. You know, they can be everywhere and nowhere at the same time. And often sometimes you're just going for little fish. But like the thing about carp now, and I don't do it. I haven't really done it, but carp are like, I mean, you could go catch a 30-pound, not 30-pound, probably like a 12-pound carp, you know, 15-pound carp, which is a huge fish, and they fight, right? And so, but they exist in all these warm water bodies. And so a big thing that people are doing right now is going and fly fishing for carp in the LA River, which is crazy. I have not fly fished in LA, but I have gone up to the Kern River, which is about 5 hours north of LA, in the Sierras, and I fished that and caught some trout. And that's something I really enjoy doing.
Very nice. And yeah, I would be worried about eating anything out of the LA River, but thankfully,
Don't
catch
eat
and
it.
release is the norm.
I'll tell you this: I wouldn't eat a fish I catch out of any river, except perhaps like a high mountain stream in the Rockies. Like, but any river that's even the rivers around here, the Catskills, I wouldn't eat those fish. Like you just, you know, these days there's so much junk in those waters that I'm surprised anybody would do it. So no, I definitely would avoid eating fish you catch unless you're literally in the middle of nowhere in a high mountain stream.
Good advice all around. And the last question, I know this is a difficult one for a fisherman. What is the biggest fish that you've caught?
So I have caught probably it's at least a 26-inch rainbow, and I thought it might be 6 pounds, but it's probably more like 8 to 10. And it was a massive, massive rainbow that I caught out of a pond in Montana. And so it's got an asterisk because I did not catch it in a river, but that was definitely the biggest fish that I've ever caught.
Bill, an impressive fish. I hope you have a nice picture of it.
Yeah, no. Well, here's what's funny. We were scouting. We were in Montana. We were scouting, and my DP had brought along like a red camera. And so she was shooting a bunch of stuff, and we were up at this pond because we were looking at it as a location. And I hooked this huge fish. She got it all on beautiful, like 4K or 2K, whatever, you know, on a red camera, and it looks gorgeous.
That is awesome. That is the best way to kind of do scouting. I love it.
Oh yeah, I mean, you know, it's not every day that you catch like the fish of a lifetime, and you happen to have like effectively a camera crew with a really high quality camera following you around. So
Yeah.
it was quite a treat.
That is awesome. So the film came out on June 9th, 2023. You are out promoting it, getting the word out, you know, going to screenings, getting people's reactions. After people check out this film, what can people look next from you? I imagine you said you've always got some scripts in your head. I imagine there's other projects that you're thinking about and working on.
Yeah, I mean, you know, they're in various stages of development. The writer's strike has obviously put sort of a hold on a lot of stuff. People are really cautious, especially now with SAG potentially striking. So it's sort of a question mark at the moment, but there's a couple things that, you know, if the strike gets resolved, it looks like they'll most likely go, but it's probably not going to be until the fall. So at the moment, you know, go back and watch my other stuff if you want to see, you know, the stuff I've already done. But as far as anything new, that's sort of dependent on where this landscape lands and if the writers end up making a deal or not.
For sure. And you can also probably, you know, release your fishing videos on YouTube, and then you can have
Exactly.
as well.
Exactly. Maybe I'll go guide for a little while or something like that.
Perfect. Awesome. Well, so you can look forward to those future projects, but before that, check out Mending the Line and Joshua's other projects from the past. Mending the Line comes to theaters on June 9th, 2023. This is Joshua Caldwell, the director of the film. Thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, thanks, man. Thanks for having me. It was a great discussion.
That was Joshua Caldwell, the director of Mending the Line, which came to theaters on June 9th, 2023. It is a heartfelt and emotional story about grief and recovery and the potentially strange things that people do to find that peace in life. If you like this interview, please like and subscribe to this channel. It helps me out a lot. Make sure all my new content goes straight to you. Thank you.